My name is Nora Sveaass. I'm Professor Emerita at the Department of Psychology, the University of Oslo, and my background is as a clinical psychologist working for many years with refugees, in particular traumatized refugees, victims or survivors of torture and other forms of ill treatment, from war, from armed conflict, from detention, and from authoritarian societies. I've always worked with the human rights aspects of this work, because as helpers, we will meet persons who have been exposed to severe and often gross human rights violations. And we must understand their problems in this context. We must approach them as survivors of human rights violations. And as I will speak about later on, we must know about what human rights are, what consequences violations have on persons' health, and also on approaching them on a human rights perspective, meaning respecting their dignity, their basic human rights, and their integrity. I will speak today about human rights and human rights also in war. Human rights and respect for human rights are of vital importance in peacetime as well as in war. Although it may sound like a paradox, there are regulations and principles regarding the human rights of war, often called international human rights law. I will start out today by saying some words about human rights in war and in peacetime. Then I will move to how we can meet persons exposed to violations, what these violations do to people, how it does affect them, and how we can meet people in the aftermath. The human rights laws in war, or rather the rules of international humanitarian law, are set out as a series of conventions and best known as Geneva Conventions. There are 4 of them all together. They're focusing on the conditions of the wounded and sick in the armed forces in the field, on the conditions of the wounded, sick, and shipwrecked members and armed forces at sea, and also the Geneva Convention number 3 relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, and last but not least, the Geneva Convention number 4 relative to the protections of civilians, civilian person, those who are not engaged in war. Article 3, as you will see here, is common to all the 4 Geneva Conventions, and it says very clearly that this is about protecting those who are taking no active part in the hostilities, including members of armed forces who have laid down their arms, and those who are not taking part in combat because of sickness, wounds, detention, or any other cause. And it's underlined in the conventions that all people must be treated with respect and egalities, that there will be no differences regarding race, color, religion, or any differences of the sort. And what are the acts that are prohibited under the Geneva Convention Article 3 in relation to civilians and those who are not taking part in war? First of all, it's prohibited any form of violence of life and person, in particular murder of all kinds, mutilation, and cruel treatment and torture. Furthermore, taking of hostages is not permitted. And furthermore, outrages upon personal dignity, in particular humiliating and degrading treatment, and this also includes sexual violence. So some words about the human rights in general. Human rights are rights inherent in all human beings, regardless of nationality, place of residence, sex, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, language, or any other status. These rights are interrelated, and they are interdependent, and they are indivisible. These are the legal norms guaranteeing these, such as international treaties, customary international law, general principles, and other sources of international law. So there's a whole system out there to protect the human rights and the implementation of these. International human rights law lays down the obligations of state to act in certain ways or to refrain from certain acts in order to promote and protect the human rights and fundamental freedoms of individuals and groups. Human rights entail both rights and obligations. That's very important. States assume obligations under international law, first of all to respect, to protect, and to fulfill the human rights. First of all, the obligation to respect means that states must refrain from interfering with or curtailing the enjoyment of human rights. The obligation to protect requires that states protect individuals and groups from the human rights abuses. And finally, the obligation to fulfill human rights means that states must take positive action to facilitate the enjoyment of the human rights. These are basic principles that refer to all human rights that we have. And again, we're all entitled to human rights, and it is of essence also that we as helpers know about them and we know what they mean in practice. And as already described, the human rights in war, the international human rights law, limits the use of violence in armed conflict to spare those who are not longer directly involved or participate in the hostilities. So the most important difference between human rights law in general and human rights law, the humanitarian human rights, is that the protection is defined to those who are in combat under international law, international humanitarian law, whereas the human rights law pertain to all of us. Ideally, all of these principles, both those laid down in the international humanitarian law and human rights law, should be respected in peace as well as in conflict. But unfortunately, we know that this is not so. Because today we know that in the ongoing war, these principles and laws are not respected. On the contrary, it seems that civilians are being targeted directly and that human rights violations that may be exposed to are among the gravest and most devastating forms of violations, acts that are totally prohibited in war as well as in peace. And with reference to the international human rights laws and principles, there is never any justification of torture or any other forms of ill treatment. And victims of such violations have rights both to justice, to redress, and to rehabilitation, although obtaining this in this situation is, of course, extremely difficult. So again, torture is an absolute prohibition of torture, and this is valid both in war and in peacetime. And the violations that we will be referring to today and that we will be meeting as helpers, unfortunately, are happening every single day. People are being deprived of their homes. They observe homes, communities, and cities being destroyed. They are threatened by arms and experiencing that loved ones are killed or threatened, or witnessing others suffering or even dying. We know that persons are being detained by soldiers, backbounded and tortured, and we know that families may be witnessing this. Some are also killed after such incidents. We know also that sexual violations is taking place. Rape and other forms of sexual harassment against women and girls, even small children, and probably also against boys and men. And some will experience the disappearance of close family. The enforced disappearance is also prohibited. They do not know about their whereabouts, whether they have been taken as hostages, been forcibly disappeared, or have not been able to find back in the tumults and the chaos of the war. In addition, the uncertainty, the lack of information, the violent climate, and the fear of one's experiences, and the fear that one experiences both for one's own life and for the lives of others are in themselves element of torture or can be understood as mental and severe torture. So again, enforced disappearances, taking hostages, summary executions are some of the violations seen today, and these altogether comprise not only war crimes, but also severe mental and psychological form of torture. All these represent serious attacks on persons' integrity, and when we meet people, they may be in the centers for internally displaced persons, they may be in hiding in their own cities, they may be abroad seeking protection in other countries, or they are in places in the country that are still considered safe. And when we meet people, we meet those who have experienced this. They may be on their way to different places, or they may have sought refuge, or we meet them as professionals, as volunteers, as helpers of different kind. And you are there to support, to listen, and to provide something that may be good for them in the midst of all the tragedy. So in the following, I will describe some ideas and approaches in relation to this. And again, to repeat what I said in the beginning, people have been exposed to severe gross human rights violations. We as helpers should have a human rights-based approach with respect for persons' dignity and integrity. Most people are deeply affected by traumatic events shortly after they have taken place. And I here, of course, include all of those violations mentioned already, but also others that we have not even been able to mention at this point. And in the longer run, we know that there will be differences in the reactions. And these reactions and the differences in the development of reactions will be depending on further former life experience, including training and preparedness, the nature of the violations themselves, and what happened afterwards. Are people taken into safety? Are they being protected? Or are they exposed to more danger, to more uncertainty? This, of course, may affect the consequences in the long run. And usually the acute reactions as we see them will be less painful and less obvious after some time, often 1 to 3 months. But again, this depends on a lot of different factors. So what is common among the reactions of those who are exposed to and subjected to severe human rights violations in war and conflict? The person is usually overwhelmed and is feeling intense fear and often anguish. Often there's a fear of life, which makes these experiences so serious. One thinks that the end is near. Sensing a total loss of control, because under these circumstances, there's no way that you can control or even to protect yourself and others. And this is often very harmful for persons. They feel that they cannot defend themselves and they cannot defend their loved ones. The power is too strong. The helplessness and humiliation that people may feel, the sense of being alone with what is happening, no place to go for protection, sensing a loss of dignity and integrity, often a very strong confusion, being bewildered with what's happening. There's often a total lack of information, and your own problem-solving capacity is often gone. And all these factors together is what makes things such a crisis and critical situation for people. So when we meet them as helpers, when we meet them in the situations that I have described, in centers, in refugee camps, in places where people are supposed to be a bit more protected, or even close to the danger, but even though a place where you can speak, you must try to establish as safe a place as possible. It's not easy, but try to find a way to speak to people in a corner or in a situation which you can create to be as safe as possible. Be calm and show understanding. Take time, never rush. Explain that you are there to support and assist. And also stay near the person, but keep appropriate distance also, depending on their age, gender, and culture. We must remember that people have been overwhelmed by others, by acts of other human beings. We must not come close or in any way push or rush or put pressure on people. Do not ask a lot of questions about what has happened, or also asking them to explain or to describe things. Give people time and give them space also to show their reactions. Do not promise too much. Let the person know who you are and that they can trust you, because feeling of distrust is, of course, very obvious in situations that people have experienced what we have spoken about. Try to calm the person and remind them of their strength and resources. This is not about painting things in pink or making a future which is not realistic, but it's also reminding them of the strength and the resources that they have despite all, and especially despite the feeling that they have themselves, that we have no strength left, we have no power or control of the situation. Because again, they have faced serious crimes, such as torture, sexual violence, war crimes, or crimes against humanity. All of these totally prohibited by as human rights violations. They're serious acts of injustice. And we can say that to people. We can remind them of this is what they have experienced. And we must also remind them of that they are in control of their story. And if they want to share their story, we can be there to listen. And we can do this with confidentiality and respect. But it's up to them to control what they want to say, how much they want to say, when they want to say it. Underline also that their dignity, their human rights, their integrity is not taken away from them. They are survivors, and they may feel that a lot has changed, but nobody is able to take away your dignity. And you can say this in a peaceful and calm way, and it's often very soothing for people to hear that. You may try to help the person understand that the reactions that they feel are reactions that frequently follow such violence. They may be even intended consequences. And doing this, we are working according to psychoeducation on trauma and trauma reactions. You may explain such things as triggers, trauma reminders, intrusive memories and flashbacks, if in their stories these things come up. And that there are ways of dealing with these, different experience, different exercises, different ways of handling this. And again, try to help the person find ways to calm him or herself. It is difficult, but it is possible. I spoke about sexual and gender-based violence in war. We know it has taken place in a number of wars, and we know, unfortunately and tragically, that it is taking place also today, probably on a large scale. And it's important for us to know how to approach these forms of violations too, because they're difficult to speak about, and most people will feel very doubtful and sometimes even shameful with respect to talking about these violations. And we must also remember that these violations are often not being alone. They are combined with all the other devastating experience that people have been exposed to. So a manual has been developed by an organization called Mental Health and Human Rights Info that has developed further on ideas and ways of tackling and meeting women, first of all, women and girls exposed to sexual violence in war and conflict. And some of the core elements in this manual is that it is human rights-based approach, it is gender sensitive, it's psychoeducative, dealing with mental health and trauma, it is resource-oriented, it speaks about the survivor, and it also speaks about the helper. It is body-oriented with exercises that you can teach people, such as grounding exercises. There's information about helping the helpers, and also some reflections on cultural sensitivity. So a toolbox is also has been compiled, and this is, as well as the manual, been translated into Ukraine. And in the toolbox, which is a compilation of the resources that may be useful, it's about dealing with triggers and trauma reminders, finding ways to stabilize and calm, teaching ways of controlling reactions, grounding exercise, dealing with stress reactions, etc. So in the field, there have been developed a number of different manuals and approaches, and on this list you will find some of them to look at after the lecture. So with these words, I hope that I've been able to present you with some points and relevant points with regard to human rights, both in peace and in conflict, and also touch upon some of the principles that may be useful when you meet people in the acute state of stress and trauma. And hopefully we will, following this, have a discussion and a conversation, sharing experiences and questions. So with this, thank you very much for your attention.